All right, welcome to Service API's meeting for October 29. We're recording, and thanks to everyone for showing up. We're getting awfully close to a V1 Alpha 1 launch, and as you can see, a lot of our agenda today is very related to that. But let's get started with our V1 Alpha 1 milestone. Most of these are now well prioritized. Yesterday, we went through, thanks to, I think it was Danian's idea, we went through and actually prioritized any bugs that were not already, didn't already have a PR that could solve them. And anything that we've labeled as critical urgent is something that we have said has to get in before our V1 alpha cut. Anything else is a nice to have, but not required and not a blocker on a V1 Alpha 1 release. So I won't go through all of these bugs again since they're pretty familiar since we covered most of them yesterday, but there are a couple new ones I created in response to that pre-alpha review doc. I'd gone through just to make sure we caught all the comments in there, and there were two that I think are significant. One, this is probably an area that James is most familiar with, and I know this is not the best time for him, but there's a problem in the listener documentation right now where listener status has a port to uniquely identify the listener or listeners it is referring to. And in the pre-alpha feedback, we got this great point that is potentially not enough. And so I've added some potential solutions here. This does not seem like one that is particularly difficult to solve, but it could result in an API addition. So just throwing that out there. I'll wait to see what James thinks of this one as well. But while we're here, does anyone have any preference on the way we proceed here?
When you say API addition, do you mean like an additional resource?
No. Sorry, what I mean is just an additional field. That's it. So there's the confusion comes from the idea that gateway listeners have a associated listener status, but the only thing to tie the two together is port. And we've been introducing ways where you could potentially specify more than one listener on a port. And right now the guidance is just shove all the status into that one listener status thing for that port. And the feedback is, well, maybe we should be a little bit more specific in the matching than just that, and have more of a one-to-one relationship between listener status and listener in the case that we have multiple listeners on a single port.
I see. Okay, yeah, I was understanding you wrong. Yeah.
Yeah.
That seems like a good addition. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think there's, you either add a name field to listeners to uniquely identify them, or you add at least protocol to listener status so you can uniquely identify a listener by protocol and port name. So I don't think this is complicated, just need to get some consensus here. And James seems to be most familiar with these areas, so I'm interested in what he says as well. The other one I've already filed a PR for. This kind of was an umbrella issue I created just to capture all the tiny little bits of feedback we've gotten in there. I've got a PR that should address all of these at this point, and we can get into that in issue triage, PR triage. But there were just a bunch of small little things here that I wanted to make sure we covered. And that's it for new. I think that means this list is finally complete. I hate to say complete, but this does feel like a list of everything we want to have done in time for V1 Alpha 1. And I would say it's also likely that it's just the union of anything that's critical urgent here or anything that already has a PR. in for it. And the rest is nice, but not necessarily required. So I think we're in a reasonably good place. I know I've said that before, but we really are making some great momentum. So thank you to everyone for the contributions here. Yesterday, we also decided that it was worth launching a second release candidate, this time on Friday. And I think this is going to be the first time where we actually do a changelog. So I will take that on. And I think the way that we can, establish consensus on a release is I will make a PR that includes the changelog. And whenever that is approved, LGTM'd, that will be the commit that marks RC2, and I'll tag that specific commit as RC. And maybe we can follow that same practice for other releases in the future as well. Yeah. And the last thing is also a bit of a holdover from yesterday. We wanted to establish some kind of a firm deadline for a V1 alpha release. As we've kind of covered here, we're getting awfully close to that release timeline. The number of issues we absolutely have to have in before then is pretty tiny. And we could keep on improving and perfecting this API, but at some point you just need to cut an alpha. And with that in mind, I wanted to actually commit to a date where we would launch. We would commit to having a V1 Alpha 1 release cut by no later than X. And so just so everyone can be looking at the same dates as I am, I just have this really simple link here. This is the month of November, starting on Sunday for us. So surely it will happen sometime in November. Yesterday we had discussed, 23rd. I hate to release anything during the week of Thanksgiving. And I also hate to release anything on a Friday. So that leads me to think one of these dates would be better for our final cut. I would personally be good with 18th or 19th, but I'm interested in feedback from the community on this one. Does that feel too aggressive, knowing what we know now about what we have left?
Yeah, I think if we boil it down, it's the two issues that are like really important, and others can be iterative addition. So yeah, I would be down for 18. Even 11 would be, I don't think, too aggressive at this point, right? And it's always better to release early and iterate, especially I think we do have a V1 Alpha 1 quality that the Kubernetes community expects. So.
Yeah, I agree with that. I made a slight change to even what I was initially. I had called this a release date that we would commit to, and I've changed that to a release deadline in the sense that we will release no later than this date. But I really, really would like to hit sometime in this week. I think that's actually realistic. But I do want to have something that is, fairly conservative, that we can say we're going to release no matter what when we hit this date. And if it's not in, it's not in. We're cutting a release. And because that's kind of a more strong statement, I think it's better to lean later, but hope for an earlier release. But I wholeheartedly agree that aiming for this week as a V1 Alpha release is ideal.
So let's say if we do get those two specific issues resolved, will we still wait for 18th or no?
I would argue no. But we have also said, and this is where we've gotten a little less clear, maybe I should run back through the milestone and actually prioritize all the PRs we have issues, all the issues we have PRs for as critical urgent, because what we've said is we want every issue that has a PR to get closed and every issue that is critical urgent to get closed. But that's kind of a rolling deadline. If we keep on adding new PRs to existing issues, then it's less and less clear. So maybe I'll run through on my own time and kind of formalize that by adding this priority to everything that has a PR existing, and that way we can have a single list of everything we've considered blocking for V1 Alpha 1. And yeah, does that seem like a reasonable balance here?
Yeah, I think I like that. Like let's do that labeling so that we are disciplined, and like scope creep at this stage is very normal. And yeah, so I think that sounds good to me.
Okay, great. With that said, I think it's reasonable to aim for the earlier of these dates. So I'm going to say November 18. Does anyone have an issue with that? Okay. I'm fine if anyone wants to push later, but unless I hear from anyone, I'm going to say November 18. All right, cool. Well, with that, we've got lots of PRs and issues to get through. I'm not going to filter just on PRs for V1 Alpha 1 Milestone this time, because we did that yesterday and we missed some relatively significant PRs. Let me go through. I know Harry had raised some issues that we should cover first.
These PRs are not specific to V1 Alpha 1, Rob. Sorry for interrupting, but yeah. So I mean, if there is something that is specific to V1 Alpha 1 that should get noticed, maybe just do that first.
Okay, let's start there, because that short name conversation I think could take some time. All right, so I'll go through this way again. This PR needs a rebase for the FAQs. Yeah, we do need some more discussion on the app protocol. Let me link over to this one. So yesterday we talked about where app protocol could fit to kind of bridge the gap between Kubernetes 1.16, which is the minimum version we're supporting for this API, and Kubernetes 1.18. And there's a lot of discussion here, but a lot of it seems to depend on, do we want to have a more complex annotation like this and set that on either route or service? Or do we want to have a very simple annotation and set that on backend policy, but then that requires a user to create backend policy? I think yesterday there was some relative consensus around maybe backend policy as a source here. But Harry, you've also added a suggestion that we could just not have structured annotations and set this on another resource instead. Yeah, maybe give what are you thinking here, Harry?
Yeah, so I think what I'm like, yeah, structured annotations can be a little painful, although my inclination is the structure presented here is not too complicated, and I think it is like it's not ideal, but I think it's not too bad given that it's a stopgap solution. And second, if it is it is a problem and we don't want to do that, what if we don't have a structured solution and you just say annotation key and the value is HTTP, HTTPS, whatever, and it applies in it, and that takes in effect whenever a gateway is talking to that service, right? No matter which port it is. Now, it obviously does have limitations, right? You cannot have between the gateway and service, you cannot have traffic flowing on different protocols. So that is a limitation. Although it does not show up in most use cases. In most use cases, the gateway and the backend usually talk on a single port, so maybe it's not a too big of a limitation. So that's what I'm thinking, right? Like, can we simplify and keep it that way?
So it sounds like you're hesitant, or you don't really like the backend policy idea. Are there reasons you would prefer to avoid an annotation there?
Yeah, I would prefer to avoid an annotation on our resources this early in our API. Like, I see annotations as, you know the last resort for extension. So if we are, like, I think, like, having a protocol inside backend policy itself, which takes precedence over app protocol for 1.18 and above, I think that makes sense, and I would like that. But having an annotation seems like we don't want to fully commit to the problem, but we still want to take a stab at solving that problem. So it seems kind of halfway between either of those solutions.
Yeah, no, I get that, and I know obviously we are all familiar with Ingress, where there's annotations everywhere. Uh, with that said, this feels like maybe it's reasonable for an exception, because what we're primarily trying to do is provide some kind of way to express this for earlier Kubernetes versions. But what we're talking about is something that will almost be deprecated on arrival, in the sense that this is something you should use for Kubernetes 1.16, 1.17, and after that, it's useless, kind of thing. So we're just trying to provide a way to, like, it would be one thing if a field didn't already exist to solve this problem, but there is a field and it's coming. So I'd hate to add another field that feels like a more permanent thing if it's just going to overlap and confuse between the app protocol field on service and, if we added an equivalent thing here, it would be less clear what should be chosen. Whereas if we just have an annotation as kind of a temporary stopgap until more users are on Kubernetes 1.18, that seems reasonable to me. But I agree, an annotation does seem to be associated with something that you're not completely committed to. But in this case, I think this is appropriate because it is intended to be a temporary feature,
I
at least
see.
as I understand.
So in that case, let's say if we go with an annotation on backend policy, how would we can users use that annotation when they are forwarding traffic to a non-service backend?
I would prefer to say no at this point, but that's a great point. Part of the issue here is we really don't understand, at least I don't understand, the potential non-service backend use cases yet and what those might look like. You can think of, I've often thought of like a storage bucket as an example of a non-service backend, and that makes sense, but that is something like where app protocol doesn't seem to apply. Like I don't know. Like it's hard for me to think of a common use case for a custom backend that is not service that requires app protocol. Not to say it doesn't exist. I just because we don't have a concrete use case yet, it's harder.
Wouldn't that have to be defined on that resource in terms of that resource? Like you would just put something similar to app protocol there on your custom one. So there's nothing that prevents you from doing that.
Yeah. It's more if there's any existing.
Yeah, and since it's not standard on our side, like we say we target service, it would either have to be like a standard well-known resource that kind of everyone agrees on, in which case we can talk about an app protocol on that thing, or it's something that is entirely custom that is outside of this, in which case you can add app protocol there anyways, if you needed
Right.
it.
Yeah, I mean, if you're thinking of just solving the service app protocol problem with an annotation and backend policy, I think that's okay. The only other concern that I would have is then backend policy resource itself will only have a selector and nothing else meaningful inside it. And right. But I think that's okay. It's still a stopgap solution. So in that case, if you're limiting that to like, if you're only trying to solve this problem for 2 versions of Kubernetes, then I think this is fine.
Yeah, I think it's like hard at this point to generalize on, because if we add it here, then going forward, when we have to, for every new custom backend that you're adding, you would have to define what that means, versus we know what it means for just service. I guess, like as Rob was saying, we need another example to help us guide generalizing between them. Doing it immediately right now might be too constraining. Well, we can tear it up anyways because it's alpha, but that's my feel on this.
Yeah, maybe to start, we call this annotation just specifically service app protocol, so it's very clear that this is tied to a service and intended for that use case only.
App protocol, wasn't it already an annotation even before 18?
In custom, there was no standard annotation that I'm aware of. There were a lot of custom ones.
Okay, I see. So yeah, I thought I recalled there was some annotation, but I guess it was not unified upstream.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in that case, then we can have this annotation. We keep this annotation. We don't need the structure if we have the backend policy. And we put this annotation on the backend policy, and that's the guidance that we have for 2 versions of Kubernetes. But then essentially it's a deprecated annotation, sort of. Yeah. Any objections on that approach?
No, I agree with that. I think it's the simplest path forward for now. And if we see a lot of need for a proper app protocol field that lots of different custom backends could benefit from, then maybe as we understand custom backends more, we can revisit this.
Sounds good. Yeah. So let me go ahead and I'll change this PR and come back to it.
Cool. Sounds good. Thanks. All right. So that was the upstream protocol. The default for hostname match. This is one of my PRs that fixes a couple different ones. This has been approved and LGTM, but I needed to rebase it. So just if anyone wants to take another look at this, I think it's really straightforward now. So I'm not going to spend much time on this call. I know we have plenty of other PRs to get to. The next one, clarify what happens when a named address is not supported. Damian, you had taken this one on. I think that the only question right now is how we want to define an IP address. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the only feedback that I saw, but I didn't see Harry's feedback there 40 minutes ago. Can you scroll down just a little bit?
Yeah.
Guess any suggestions? Typically there's like an RFC that we reference. I mean, RFC 791 is pretty old, but it does talk about the requirements for an IPv4 address.
So I get that. So, but what exactly are we trying to communicate here to the end user of the API here? Like,
what an IP address type is. Essentially saying that we would support the proper representation of an IPv4 or a v6 address.
I see. Okay. So for
I think
V6,
this is just like the textual representation, right?
Textual representation, I believe it's, yes.
So that would be, there's some bizarro ones like the single number, which no one uses, but yeah, it would be IPv4 and IPv6. Does 791 have IPv6 in it?
no, I think that's why we are referencing 5952,
I
line
see.
551. So does anyone know what upstream uses?
Yeah, so I spent some time actually, I read through these comments and I wanted to dig through how we're defining IP addresses in Kubernetes upstream. And actually, surprisingly, I could not find any references to RFCs or really much of any detail. It was almost assumed that, like it was, this is either an IPv4 or IPv6 address. That was about as specific as I could find in upstream. There was not a lot of additional detail around what an IP address was or a great definition.
Yeah, this one seems pretty straightforward. We just need to find the right reference because inet Python has like 3 is an IP address, which is, I guess, okay. We just have to have a test case for it because some controllers might find that strange. And then the other one is the 0 elision rules for IPv6, which I think is like pretty standard, but again, needs a reference.
I see. In that case, I think we are mentioning RFC 5952. Maybe if you open that diff section, Rob, that won't open up there. But even in there, I think we can just mention that's for IPv6, and then we have for IPv4 we can have this RFC. I think.
Yeah, I mean, it almost feels like the paragraph above is sufficient. What else are we trying to add here?
Yeah, and I'm starting to wonder if this is kind of scope creep too, in the sense that this was Godoc that was already in there. And if we go, can we go back to the issue that this is trying to address really quick?
Yeah, the issue
so
is
I do
much,
feel like we're kind of out of scope. So if we feel like, I guess it could go, I mean, I'm sure it's clarification that we should include, but I do
Can
feel
we
like
delete the reference to inet Python? Maybe that's sufficient.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say too. I think I think we could just delete this sentence and start with if the requested address is unsupported.
All right. So
even
I'll
though
go ahead and
I admit this is scope creep, but hopefully it's not too bad if we agree that just removing that address is fine.
All right, I'll delete that first sentence. The rest of the changes that that the PR introduces, does that everything else looks reasonable or not?
Yeah, it made sense to me. I need to. I looked through it once and I didn't have any feedback to add, which meant, other than what was already said about what was apparently a little out of scope here.
There was one comment, and this is again a scope creep, so we can choose not to have that discussion. But named address type is an address selected by name.
Yeah.
What is the meaning of that sentence?
Very vague because it's dependent on the controller, right?
Yeah.
But does it mean it's like a C name, or like what am I supposed to?
Okay, so for a cloud implementation that would represent a named address that you would, you would just plug in the name and the cloud controller would look up in named addresses and map to that IP address associated with that name.
Yeah, this is a discussion that we had with some other folks as well. A lot of the clouds have a notion of reserving a name and having the address be a resource, is how this ended up here. Oh yeah, its support is implementation specific, but we're putting in the API. Interesting. I think it should be extended, right? Or we can remove it. But it's definitely a notion that's like really common in clouds.
So it's like, what does it boil down technically to? Is it like a good example, like CNAME a good example, or?
Oh, we could give an example. It's basically a resource link. Like for example, Azure, you can reserve an address and you can give, that's like a resource, like an object that's created, and then you can reference it.
But you can't reference it here. Like address type is like I don't think you have like an object ref or whatever here, right?
Oh, yeah, I'm not talking about a Kubernetes object.
I see. Okay.
But yeah, Rob, we should, it's a good point. Like, should it be an object reference instead? Or we remove it?
Generally aren't these, wouldn't they have kind of globally unique names?
Yes, that's right. Like that the structure of the name is implementation specific, but the fact that you can name an address as a resource with quotes, not resource Kubernetes, is sort of what this is trying to get at.
So I think let's get this PR out. I think we're getting into a long discussion and maybe have another issue to discuss this. I think we have already spotted a couple of issues here.
Yeah, I'd agree that this is a net positive addition, and then we can separately discuss what named address should really look like and if we need to change or remove anything about it. Yeah. All right, let's keep on going then. Damian, do you need anything else from us on this?
No, I'll go ahead to remove the one sentence that we agreed to, update the PR. Do you want me to take the action item of creating the, I don't know if it's one or if it's two issues related to, what a named address is?
Yeah, I think just a single follow-up issue would be great if you are able to do that.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and do that and link it to this PR.
Great. Okay, so this one I've already covered. This is the same PR that is approved, just needs another LGTM after the last rebase. And the cleanup from pre-alpha review, yeah, let's cover this real quickly. This is a PR I got in last night. There's a lot of relatively tiny changes here. I was hoping none of them would be too controversial, and it just seemed easier than a PR for each one. One of Tim's comments in PR pre-alpha feedback was that we had an unbounded list, and you can never have an unbounded list in Kubernetes. So I just added an upper limit of 100 to the number of gateways that could be stored in route gateway status. Then let me just look at the diff because there's not that much in here. There's a little typo fix here, resource to kind to match our latest thing. There was also some feedback that undefined had scary connotations depending on languages that you'd worked with, and so unspecified seemed to be a safer way to describe this. really tiny change, open to other words here, but undefined was unpopular. There was also some confusion around HTTP route filter conformance. We had listed a filter as core, but then it could be used in a forward to, and then it would not be core in that sense. So, oh, I got this wrong. Let me fix this myself. This should be HTTP route forward to that I want here. But yes, basically defining the two different levels of conformance depending on where it's actually used. And the next one was a lot of cleanup around weight. So there's a couple things here. One of the large ones is there's a question around why we had such a low maximum for weight. And the answer was, well, it seems like most everyone can get enough precision out of, on a scale of 1 to 10,000. But even still, there's no reason that we can't have a higher weight. And we looked at alternatives and they often had higher weights, like sometimes the max of int 32 as an example. So with that, this increases that to 1 billion. Harry correctly pointed out that not every implementation is going to support arbitrary weights. And that's a great point. I tried to clean this up based on some feedback in the rest of this thread. So basically the key sentence is, for non-zero values, there may be some epsilon from the exact proportion defined here, depending on the precision an implementation supports. So this is computed by weight divided. So you have a proportion, and then that will be mapped to whatever precision that implementation can actually support. Does that feel like a reasonable compromise here? I don't know, Harry, does that help with your use case, or would you rather just have a lower weight still?
Maybe some, I'm still reading, just a second.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, I think that could be confusing for users.
Okay.
I think, yeah, I mean, it's more about like for non-zero value, there might be some exact proportion. Okay. Yeah, I think that's yeah, that could be a little confusing, but the number of users who would run into this would be not too high, right? Like it's more like, are you trying to do like a weight between two backends of 1 and then 1 billion, right? So like you want to, like, if that is the case, it's hard, right? But if you have like 100 and a bit, like maybe a million and a billion, that essentially translates to 1:1,000, right? And
yeah.
So that math could be done, and the controllers could be smarter that way. But yeah, I don't know if people actually do that kind of.
Yeah, this really does feel like quite an edge case. I'm not particularly tied to this large of a number. I do admit that 10,000 is rather arbitrary and potentially too low. And just a quick survey here. We know what Kong supports. Anyone else know what their implementations max out at here, or the precision that they can provide? Okay, well, maybe that can be a follow-up then.
And the other question is, do you have that level of traffic, right?
Yeah.
Large providers like Google could have that, but like if you are really splitting traffic between like a billion requests, even a million
Right.
requests, it gets harder to test it. So, and I also don't know why Kong has that arbitrary limit. I need to go back and check.
But isn't it? Won't you just scale it anyways into your range?
Well,
at the end of the day,
I think the argument is fair, is that if a user requests 1 in a billion chance of going to a certain backend, and the implementation can either translate that into 1 in 65,000 or 0 in 65,000, that's a fairly significant difference.
I don't like for practical purposes or like from a mathematical standpoint. I do agree though that we shouldn't go so high, like maybe make it fit into an int32, especially adding up multiple of them, because I know that some people had a interesting experience where they used the max value and then it ended up overflowing like an int when they had multiple weights. So that's just one thing to consider if you're going to have like a super high value.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And what is the motivation? Like, why are we, like, if somebody is requesting a billion, what is the use case that they're requesting a billion here?
That's just dynamic range, and some people may be encoding stuff in there. The reference we have is for scheduling priorities, which is actually like the number can be gigantic, and they just allowed space.
Interesting.
I think scheduling priority is like an N64, which is pretty humongous. Although, Rob, we should just double check. I don't think a billion is going to over an N64, but like if you had 100, like a split among 100 backends, and then you like add them all up, like for example, int32 seems like a pretty good number, and then we divide it by like 1,000, and then if you add them all up, your math won't overflow. That might be reasonable.
Yeah, I'm trying to find where we've said the number of backends that or the number of forward twos that we support. But it is enough that if everyone specified the max value here, I think we'd overflow an int32.
Oh, that already flows in 32, I think.
We have only 4 forward twos that we allow.
Yeah, okay.
But I would say like on the order of 1,000 probably, to just be conservative, and then we don't overflow that. That's what I would think. Like everyone has moved on to int64, so int32 probably is just will fit everything. And then if you divide by 1,000, I don't know, I wouldn't lose too much sleep on this, given most users won't try to peg it at the max.
Right.
So like there are weird use cases. For example, like that thing I was alluding to earlier where people were trying to peg it at the max. They did that to get a specific behavior out of the system. And then they didn't realize that if you actually set it at the max, it would like overflow.
Yeah. Okay, well, yeah, I'll think about this a little bit more and try to understand what a reasonable middle ground is here. This does feel too high, and this does feel potentially a bit too low. And I'll come back and update this PR. We are over time here, so let me just real quickly highlight this PR because it's worth some broader community feedback. Istio already exists and is already using a gateway resource and already using a GW short name. The argument had been, well, okay, if we at least use different short names, we can coexist relatively happily. Another argument is, well, we can just, we can never be completely unique here. So
by the way,
there's a long discussion.
Potentially renaming, like, let's just pick one and move on.
Yeah. My argument has been that we shouldn't intentionally overlap here more than we already are. So using a different short name, even if it's not quite as nice, might allow the two to coexist for a bit longer. But yeah, we don't have enough time to discuss on this call, but I do want to at least raise attention to this. So if you have strong feelings about what we should use here, definitely add some comments on this PR. Yes. Okay, cool. Well, we're over time here. I'll plan on filing a PR to update a change list on Friday, and hopefully we can get a release candidate out then. And we're getting awfully close to a release. So yeah, thanks everyone for the help. Have a great rest of your week, and we'll talk to you next week.